Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
And we are just welcoming you guys back to part 2 of our discussion with Lynette Webber and her fascinating
It was
exploration.
fascinating. It really was.
Yes, into the lives of the Cornish miners who came all the way from Cornwall, Great Britain, and first went to like Wisconsin and Michigan. And then after the gold rush of 1859, actually, some of it was the gold rush of 1849 too, if you go back far enough in her stories,
Yeah.
went to California, but a lot of them ended up coming to Colorado.
And family connections. It's like some
yes,
stayed in Michigan and some came out here, and that's how she found them through when she was visiting during the Association of Gravestone Studies conference almost a year ago, last June.
Last June. Yeah, I know it was like a year ago. So this is part 2 of that discussion with her. It was such a fascinating discussion, and she had so many pictures. So again, if you saw part 1, make sure you go back and watch this again on YouTube. If you haven't watched part 1 on YouTube yet, we highly recommend you do, because Lynette put together a beautiful presentation that includes really photographs of many of the women that she talks about, as well as the husbands, the grave sites, both in Colorado and in Michigan. She took a ton of photos of both. So this really gives you a very pictorial view of her story, as well as you can see dates, and she's got everything put together in a lovely presentation. So again, our continuation of Cousin Jennies is what she entitled her presentation. So we entitled that as the episode. So Cousin Jennies, part 2, Cornish women of mining country cemeteries.
So coming back to Pine Grove Cemetery, where Libby's little brother Oscar, Henry Oscar, the namesake of her son Oscar, was interred, I thought I would share a couple of photos of this place, since we've gotten a good idea of what the Bald Mountain Cemetery was like, to just get a feel for this.
They're very similar.
So there are some definite similarities. At Pine Grove Cemetery in Eagle Harbor, there is a Catholic section and a Protestant section. We are, I believe, looking here at a series of grave lots that still have their iron fencing intact.
Yes.
And a number of what we can see in this one are large, mostly unpolished granite monuments. But there are
the iron crosses.
Plenty of graves that don't have iron surroundings or never did. There are a lot of marble stones that are sugaring, stones that are delaminating, and then a marvelous assortment of these iron crosses, which were cast by the Kohler Company in an earlier iteration of Kohler, Wisconsin, and were typically seemed to be used for German-speaking Catholics. So this is the Catholic side of Pine Grove Cemetery.
I remember coming across them in a different cemetery down south here in Pueblo and wondering, because I hadn't really ever seen them before. But yes, it was like a German tradition, and they were doing it in Germany before they came over here. And then they continued their tradition of these iron crosses even here.
Yeah,
but then this
there
is
were
where
different styles, but this one in particular seems to be cast from the same exact mold that the one in the basement of the Kohler Museum.
Oh, cool.
Is. So I was able to put that together.
So this is where there was the mine, the iron.
So we're back in the copper country here.
Yeah.
Eagle Harbor and Eagle River are 2 of the cemeteries we're going to see here. And they are both water access that is closest to some of these mines. It wasn't the mining community necessarily, but it was where all of the shipping and all of the arrivals took place. They were kind of like the small port communities for the mining companies. So here's the cemetery in Eagle River, which Jane Broad Williams, Richard's mother, described in 1889 as being the landing docks for stores for many of the mines and for shipping the large masses of native copper. Now, in Eagle River at the Evergreen Cemetery, the only cemetery is a Protestant cemetery. And you see something that makes me very sad, but I don't think anyone's doing any more. That a lot of these stones have been painted white
Mm-hmm.
in what seems an attempt to make them look all the same and uniform. And please don't paint gravestones.
No, it's not good for the
Please
stone.
don't do it. No, it isn't at all. And in a very Cornish tradition, which I noticed in the Bald Mountain Cemetery too, the way that some of these people died is carved right into their gravestones. So these two, Henry Hart and James Fezzi, died in an accident. They were killed at the Copper Falls mine in 1872. And I believe it was a total of 6 men in that particular accident. So this is Alice Nichols, Jane Broad Williams' sister-in-law, Richard Broad Williams' aunt.
Wow.
And so we're going to leap across some of the branches of this family tree and talk for a minute about Alice, because we know that her sister-in-law certainly did. So she was born in 1842 in Hillstown, Cornwall, Great Britain, and Hillstown is considered, I believe, the first purpose-built company town in Great Britain. And so she would have come from communities that were operated by a single business entity, much like the copper country mining communities tended to be. And they went to Mineral Point, Wisconsin, to the lead mine area there in the 1840s before they came to Michigan's copper country in 1855. Now, this is where I was like, wow, this is how I learned that it took so much effort to get from southern Wisconsin to upper Michigan in 1855, because in Alice's obituary, I learned that they were on the first steamer through the Sioux locks at the St. Mary's River, St. Marie. So Lake Superior is at a higher level than Lake Huron and Lake Michigan and Lake Ontario and Erie. And instead of trying to haul everything overland from one place to the next, or maybe try your best to manage to push a boat over the waterfall, which did happen a few times, but it didn't always go very well. Now that the locks are in place, you can actually take a steamer from Lake Huron and Lake Michigan into Lake Superior. And Alice was on the first boat.
How cool is that?
Along with her family. But they were only in the copper country for a short period of time before they lost her father, Henry, as the first person to die in an accident at the central mine, which is a ghost town. You can go and visit today. There are several buildings that are kept up by a local historical society.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, the Wisconsin Historical Society is pretty darn impressive with what they do to preserve the history there.
Yeah, and we've got local societies here up in Upper Michigan that do a fantastic job with it as well. A lot of heritage tourism has been developing in the area, and I'm hoping that someday, the cemeteries can contribute more to that, because they're better kept and easier for people to find. So
yes,
trying to promote that process myself. So in 1861, so she's 18, she marries Emmanuel Broad at Clifton in Keweenaw County. Clifton is just the village name for the Cliff Mine. It was never an official village. There was never a village government. It was just owned by the mining company, but they called it Clifton for a little while. Emmanuel Broad is the uncle of Richard Broad Williams. And so his sister, Jane Broad Williams, is the dear mom from the story about the children. So
wow,
if that makes any sense, they're all very connected. They were all living in Keweenaw County before they ended up heading towards Nevadaville and Central City.
I love it.
So we have a picture of Alice here. Alice was not as well recorded as the other branches of the family in photography, so far as I can tell. She seems to be really young.
She doesn't, yeah, she looks like a teenager in this photo.
And she has, it looks like very straight hair that's been teased with a lot of pain into ringlets.
but smooth as the top. Like they've smoothed it down to about where her ears are, and then all the ringlets at the back. And her dress is not super fancy. It's, one plain piece, and there's a white collar attached to a dark color of fabric with just buttons down the front, but there's no jewelry or lace or any other kind of embellishment on it. It's very, she does, it looks like she's probably got a brooch on at the collar.
Right.
But
and it looks as though her cuff might have a little bit of lace on it. It might be something gathered inside her cuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
Nothing else.
It's a very simple
plain,
dress.
Very simple. She appears to be, I don't think, any more than maybe 16.
When did her dad, how old was she when her dad died?
In 1856, she was 14 almost.
Yeah.
So that could be, she was 13 for this picture because the family didn't have the funding to continue doing regular photography after that.
Yeah.
Could be the case. And because I don't have more pictures of Alice, I've made an exception and put a picture of her husband up. This is Emmanuel.
He was a very handsome man. I love the beard. And
he's well put together here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of hair on that head.
I know. I was just looking at that. He's got all the hair and he's got it all combed back, and then he's got a beard and even a little bit of a mustache going on, but he's not very old in that picture. No. Like if you get rid of the beard, you can tell he's a young man when that picture was taken.
Yeah, I think he couldn't be out of his 20s.
No, definitely not. He still has the very young face, and without a beard, he'd have a baby face.
That might be why the beard.
Exactly. Take him more seriously when he's trying to, make business transactions and such.
Absolutely. So they start to have their family either before or shortly after their marriage. Daughter Marianne is born. It depends on which birth date you believe for her. But not that that matters. We can move on to the birth of son Emmanuel Jr. in 1863 and the birth of Sarah Adeline in 1865. So this family, like the other one, is having kids through the Civil War period. And
one right after the other.
Yep, just a 2-year gap at maximum. Here we're seeing for quite some time. And then they have Griselda, also known as Isabel or Belle, Griselda Mabel in 1867, which is on the very first page of Michigan birth records for Keweenaw County, which started in 1867.
Okay.
So I can actually find her actual date of birth, but it didn't seem fair to her siblings. And
there's
so
a record.
I let it be. But shortly after Belle has died, Emmanuel is injured in a mine accident. And I haven't been able to get a lot of details about what the initial injury was, except for that it was spinal. And that over the years, as time passed, he was faced with greater and greater paralysis.
Oh, poor thing.
He couldn't work anymore.
He couldn't work in mining anymore. And there would be some efforts by the community to help to take care of the family in a way that didn't seem like charity. They had a son in 1870. And in 1871, Emmanuel was named notary public. So he makes it into all the Senate journals for just that one mention because he was decided to be a notary public of Keweenaw County.
Well, and then the mining companies, there was no such thing as workman's comp. The mining companies would not have taken care of him and his family, even though he may have been injured at work, right? There was no provision.
Well, there was no legal requirement. Some companies would try to help some people more than others, but until the 1910s, there was no legal obligation to do so. And there were county poorhouses. It wasn't even a statewide welfare system yet. If you couldn't work and you couldn't be taken care of by your family, there weren't a whole lot of options, but those options that there were provided on a more local level than most of the things we see today. And in 1875 or thereabouts, Emmanuel starts an 8-year span of serving as the Keweenaw County correspondent for the Copper Country Evening News. So it seems that with some assistance, he was able to be out and about enough to report on some events. And between being a notary public and working for the newspaper, he's able to, do some desk work. He was still able to use
provide for his family.
writing hands and continue to help raise his family. And he absolutely stayed with the family. He was there for all of his children's developmental milestones, and for many of their developmental their children's developments as well. And so we might have noticed that we weren't really sure if they were married before or after the birth of their oldest daughter, Mary. But we do know for certain that that daughter had a son in 1887 outside of wedlock, and that she'd had a daughter, it seems, earlier than that, who didn't survive very long.
Oh, wow.
On the same page, so a month and a half later, her sister Sarah gave birth to her eldest child, Gertrude, also before her marriage. So we don't really know the exact circumstances that happened here, but it's easy to speculate that in Keweenaw County, where the population was reduced substantially again after the Civil War, and a lot of the churches weren't active, that it could very well be that this couple was not legally married yet, but they would be soon, because both of these daughters of Emmanuel and Alice Broad would be married within a short time, and their husbands gave these children their names.
Well, it even says under sex, illegitimate, and then the father's name is unknown. Oh, wow.
And so we don't know the circumstances. It could be that the community already acknowledged that they were a couple and that they were just waiting for the priest to make it to the county because he wasn't always there. It could be that because both of these women were Protestant Cornish women who ended up marrying French Canadian Catholic men, that there was some other trouble in just getting that ceremony taken care of. But these women both kept their children and raised them. And so I think that it's further proof that Alice was an incredible mom, taking care of their family through all of the challenges that they had there. And an absolute treasure from the family on Ancestry, I was able to find this picture of a pink and blue dress. Unless you two see, do you see gray and white?
I see
so
pink
I see
and blue.
pink and blue, or like a creamy pink and blue. To me, it looks mostly pink and blue, though.
Yeah, I think it's pretty distinctive. And it's a two-piece dress that looks kind of like a formal waistcoat bottom type of dress that it seems to be in a lighter fabric of pink, a pale pink, and then a richer fabric of a dark navy blue color.
Yeah, and that blue fabric looks like maybe some sort of silk because it's got a little bit of a sheen to it.
It does. And there seems to be a small train
on the back side
that's coming
That's
off
what I was wondering, if it might have
of
been a bustle skirt. That's why it's so much longer.
That's what I'm thinking.
This is from daughter Griselda, or Belle's wedding. She was born in 1867, according to that earliest birth record we have. And she married in 1882 in this dress. Now, if you do that math, and she hadn't had a birthday yet, you will find that she was 14 years of age when she got married in 1882. The record says she was 17, but her birth record disagrees with that assessment.
There was somebody we covered not too long ago, and I'm trying to remember which episode, where it was the same sort of thing. Her actual age, if you did the math, was around 14 or so, but the record stated that she was 18 already, but that would not be true. So I'm wondering if they did that for the purposes of being more prudent, maybe in the record. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a few different reasons it could be. In this case, I'm pretty sure it wasn't an elopement. because in 1882, the witness was Emmanuel Broad. Now we have two Emmanuel Broads. There's father and son. But since the son would have only been 19, I don't think he would have been qualified to witness the marriage as yet, because you weren't considered an adult. Now his 14-year-old sister could get married, but I don't think he was legal to witness it.
To witness the marriage. Oh, I love it. I love that they have her dress, though.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
It really is incredible to think about. And it seems as though she was pretty successful in her marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So far as such things went, the family also, seems very proud of where they come from, and they've really clung to the pieces and heirlooms from it, and I think it's absolutely beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't know the reasons for Belle's marriage either, but we can assume that they at least eventually loved one another, because they stayed together for a very long time. And not everyone in her family did.
Right. Aww.
So what did people think of Alice? So we have a few different ways of understanding how people thought of Alice. One of them is a letter from her sister-in-law to her nephew upon her death. And that letter reads in part, "Thursday we had a letter from Emmanuel Broad Jr. His mother died the morning of the 26th of March. She was only sick 2 days after another son of hers has been ill with sciatica rheumatism. I say her son because he has borne long since Emmanuel was hurt. What poor Emmanuel will do now she is gone, I don't know, for he is helpless and can scarcely move hand or foot." Jane Broad Williams, in her last letter to son Richard Broad Williams, which was found with a bullet through it in his pocket.
Oh.
After
he was shot. Yeah.
After he was shot. Yeah. And so this is, she says some things. I was sorry to hear, because my brother is going to struggle now that he's lost his wife, but I don't think her kids were his anyway. It's kind of the impression that you get from this here. I don't know the details about Emmanuel's injury, but I certainly don't know enough to rule out the possibility. And I wonder if she's actually reflecting upon, her opinion of what's happened with her nieces.
That could be
there as well, without naming names.
Without saying it, yeah.
But it seems that the community had a very different idea of who Alice was and what she meant to them. So according to a newspaper published in the Cornishman in Penzance, Cornwall, Great Britain, so this was published across the globe from here, Mrs. Emmanuel Broad of Vaughnsville showed devoted attention to a crippled husband for 30 years. Herself dead, those who appreciated her devotion, purchased for her remains a space in Eagle River Cemetery. A handsome memorial stone suitably inscribed, protected by rails, will hand down to future generations a record of her wifely and long-continued devotion.
Aww.
And so this is what the community thought of Alice.
Oh, that's a nice monument.
Mm-hmm. It's a lovely monument. It is a really large iron enclosed plot in the Eagle River Cemetery. It's a marker that is of unpolished granite, and so it's very difficult to read it well. I did not take the picture to the right. Someone else had already used other substances to fill in the lettering and taken the image, and I chose to use it because it allows us to read in memory of Alice, the beloved wife of Emmanuel Broad, who died at Vaughnsville on the 26th day of March, 1896, aged 53 years, 9 months, and 1 day. But I do not recommend putting any foreign substances besides perhaps water and D2 on a tombstone. But yeah, this is not the simple flat gravestone
that
the community puts up for its paupers.
No, and she even has a footstone too, if you look at the picture
She does. And so does Emmanuel when he
Yeah.
was buried alongside her when he died 3 years later.
How cool. Yeah, there's a footstone and the very nice, like layered monument. It's in
Well, and just the
5
fence
layers.
itself.
Yeah,
It's
because it's got like a.
substantial. There's probably room for like at least 5 or 6 people in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big plot.
And the gate still works on the fence and everything.
And the fence is still standing too.
And it looks good. You can see some of the rocks that were used to shore it up
Mm-hmm.
under the front edge of it. And in the background, how sparse these
Yeah,
iron fences are in this particular cemetery. So hers
it's a
is
beautiful
unusual one.
cemetery.
Yeah, all the
Yeah.
trees are like further back. They're not up where the graves are. They're all back to the outside of it.
Most
Very
of them.
cool.
So we've talked about the people that I found after I started going off on my tangents, but I thought we would take a moment to look at Jane George Peters because she's the one in the Cliff Mine Cemetery that I started looking into, that I finally found all these connections that took me back to the Bald Mountain Cemetery in Colorado. So even though we don't have fabulous photos of Jane George Peters, I thought she's worth talking about as we finish up here today. She was born in 1836 in Briege, Cornwall, Great Britain. So the same generation as a couple of the other women that we've looked at. And her brother, John Isaac George, who will be relevant, was born when she was 9 years old, also still in Cornwall. That's where she still lived when she married William A. Peters, another one of those first names as a surnames of Cornish families. And shortly after their marriage, they immigrated to the Cliff Mine, the village of Clifton, Michigan, where he's actually working as a mine captain. So that experience, that Cornish engineering background of sorts of his was put to good use, and he had a good paying job there.
I was gonna say, yeah, he got paid a little bit more for that type of job.
Right. And that'll be reflected in a little bit here. In 1865, they have their first known child. It seems likely that there might have been an earlier pregnancy, but I have found no evidence of it.
Right.
And Ella dies very young. In 1866, so the next year, their son William John is born. And the next year, he dies. In 1867, Jane is a witness at Clifton to the marriage of her brother, John Isaac George, to an Elizabeth Williams. This is Libby's sister-in-law, Elizabeth, the daughter of Elizabeth.
All the Elizabeths.
All the Elizabeths. So actually, I think this one might be a daughter of Jane, but this is one of Richard Broad Williams' sisters.
Okay.
That is getting married here in Cliff Mine, and to Jane George Peters' brother. And so it took me a while to figure out, how did I ever end up on this family? It took me a while to track down this convoluted connection.
Yeah.
Through all these Elizabeths.
There are so many. Lizzie's, Eliza. Actually, Richard Williams had a sister named Elizabeth, one named Eliza, and one named Susan Elizabeth. So
Oh my goodness.
It got even more complicated. They have 2 more children, including a second John William, as we noticed with Matilda in the beginning and have seen repeated with Lillian's and several other names throughout. And in 1870, son Thomas is born. These 2 sons will survive to adulthood.
Yay.
But Jane isn't going to see it because in 1874, she has a daughter, Catherine, and then she and Catherine die within a week of one another, about a week of one another. And because it wasn't, Catherine was born in January and she died in June. It doesn't seem like it was related to childbirth. It was probably one of the epidemics. but we don't have a death record for either of them to be confident what it might have been.
Right.
So the Cliff Mine Protestant Cemetery is currently in the woods. But 120 years ago or so, it was an old mining ghost town that was already falling apart, and it had a couple of cemeteries in it. And it had giant rocks that had fallen down from the cliff sides beside it.
Wow.
And just scattered across things. And so we have an image here from about 1900 from the Michigan Tech Archives. And it has just a big boulder as the centerpiece. But if you look off to the left of that boulder, you can see a fenced cemetery with smaller fenced plots located inside of it. One of those fenced plots was the one that belonged to Jane George Peters and her young children who died while they were living at Clifton. And there are also some remaining wooden markers on that site, and one of them is in this as well. So the Peters stone is well, it's not a huge obelisk, but it is a substantially sized stone, the largest one in the cemetery.
Oh, there
And
it is.
this is what it looks like today. So on the left, we have a picture of this stone, which is probably at least 7 or 8 feet tall. And a couple of footstones leaning against the roots of a now dead tree beside it. And that tree is also propping up pieces of a dilapidated wooden fence, which we saw as a white picket fence in the previous image.
Wow. Because there was like no trees there at all.
There was nothing.
Yeah, nature has definitely reclaimed that space.
That's
with
crazy.
People being gone.
Sometimes you find sticks or pieces of logs in the woods there, and you're like, okay, I have to look at this really close. Was this part of a wooden grave marker? Do I want to lean it somewhere where I might find again? Or is it just a fallen branch or
Part
limb?
of a tree, yeah.
It can be really hard to determine back in there.
That's crazy.
But here we can see the side of the marker, because each is dedicated to Jane or one of her children, that is dedicated to Jane herself. And it reads, in memory of Jane, the beloved wife of William Peters, died June, I think that's 28th, 1874, aged 31 years.
I was to say, I think that says 31.
Years. I think it says 37. I think 37 is right, but I'm not super confident reading it from here, and I'd have to double check.
Well, and it's a little, as you go further down the monument, that's more of the moss has taken over.
Yes, it becomes harder to read, and the letters are smaller.
Yep.
And you can kind of fill in the blanks between D-I blank and D and guess what it might say on a tombstone. But when it comes to the numbers, it gets a little tricky.
Yeah, it does.
But just the dramatic difference.
I know, when there was nothing there but the cemetery to a forest.
That tree's dead already, even. It's been dead for a while. I mean, it really is astonishing to see how nature takes over, but also, I mean, how we can still find these remnants of the past, regardless of what's grown up around them.
That's so...
I know, it's like, yeah, it's amazing.
Sorry, we're being very reflective here.
Yeah, but it's like in Michigan, granted, there's, I don't think things would grow that quickly here, but in Michigan, it's just, it really is amazing seeing just that, like you said, the earth reclaimed.
They have more water than we
land
do.
or whatever. I'm not saying it. Yeah, they have a lot more water than we do, but
yeah, we have lots of water. We're surrounded by water here.
I was gonna say they have a lot of water.
Superior, it's a Great Lake. So I did find this one other picture, and I wanted to share it with you because I found it very charming and unusual.
Mhm.
This is a picture of Jane's brother John, Isaac George, and Richard Broad Williams' sister, Elizabeth Broad Williams, during their short marriage. He only survived for about 5 years after they were married before he died in a Eureka, Nevada mine accident.
He had
But
a
during
beard
that,
too.
yeah, he did, although he doesn't have a mustache and his beard's a little bit scruffier
Yeah, his is a
than
little bit different in
Emmanuel's.
style.
But look at her.
She's pregnant.
She is heavily pregnant.
Definitely, yes.
And I just don't see many images that make it clear that women were pregnant from this time frame, this immediately after the Civil War.
Yeah, maternity photo shoots weren't a thing yet.
No, that's, I think, a little bit more of a modern idea. And I just found it so unusual and so human, again, that we get to see this woman at this stage of her life.
I also get the feeling she's much taller than him. He looks short just sitting there.
You could almost see lifts in his shoes, I think.
He just looks, I mean, she's standing, I mean, granted she's pregnant, but she's pretty erect and straight. So I feel like if he stood up next to her, his head is still going to be like at her ear level.
Well, and it's as though her maternity gown has an extra tier to it so that if she were seated, it would cover things more thoroughly. And you might not even be able to tell she was pregnant if, or at least not with this confidence, if she was seated because of its design. And I feel like that was a very deliberate choice.
I love it. Yeah, like you said, you don't get to see very many maternity photos from this time period because they didn't, when they got to a certain stage, a lot of times they were kind of not out and about in public until after the baby was born. So the fact that they decided to take a photograph at that moment was awesome.
It would be nice to know why.
Well, and I also wonder because, so we have this picture of Elizabeth Broad Williams and the picture of Richard Broad Williams with his wife. In both cases, the women are standing and the men are seated. And I wonder if it was some sort of family tradition for portraits or if it's just happenstance, or it could have been the same photographer.
That's what I'm wondering. The photographer just had a particular way that he liked to pose people and maybe. I think it's cool though.
And her hair is so very smooth and coiffed.
And she has a lot of it. You could tell by the way it's poofed in the back where it's she's got it up, but
like
there's
she's got a,
I mean, she could have a hairpiece in there too. That was popular in the day. They did use hairpieces, but it, you know, it's very shiny and pretty. I love his curls too. He's got natural curls in his hair.
Yes,
and it's like a mop of curls right on top of his head.
It was okay. So the other guy with the beard, that was his brother, right?
That was his. No, that was more distant. The other, I think Richard Broad Williams might have a beard in the picture, but that wasn't what we were focused on then. That was Emmanuel. It was his brother-in-law.
Yes.
Okay. Gonna say the hair, they got, must be something in the water because the guys have really good hair.
Yeah, it could have been all that extra mineral content.
Something, because they all have gorgeous hair. All these men are like,
it does seem pretty unfair. So I just made a couple of quick slide sheets, but if there was anything that you all would like to revisit and go back through, I would be happy to discuss as much as you would like.
Oh, I just loved it because it was just the connections, and it proves when you start digging just how close we are or not that distant from these people. And I was telling Jenny I was doing that this weekend because I'm transcribing our cemetery books from the cemetery, and it's, of course, cemetery books from the cemetery. Right. But I'm going through and it's like from 1890, and it's like every once in a while somebody will jump out, and then I went down rabbit holes, but it's like we're not that distant from them.
No, we're all connected. And with that in mind, if you would like, I could spend a few minutes jotting down a family tree for you to put on the website or something, if that would help clarify, because I was kind of all over the place, and I knew it because that's honestly how you find the best stuff, is looking at the associates and their friends and their neighbors.
And reading the newspapers and
Oh, you have to do that. Yeah. I mean, you have to go down all these rabbit holes so you can find this stuff. That
I
was
just think it's so fascinating that we have so many of the families that are on, like you said, almost an island in your little peninsula up there that's remote and harder to get to. And yet so many of them left that space to come out here to Colorado to another more remote, harder to get to. Like they really liked to get to the hard to get to places. It wasn't like it was easy to get to any of those places. Not to mention they had to leave their whole other country behind and cross a whole big ocean in between all of that. So
that was fascinating. I mean, it was just so
these families are fascinating.
And those jaunts to California. I'm just going to go to California. No big problem. I just got to go, around a whole continent because we don't have a Panama Canal yet. No big deal.
I'll just be out there for a couple of years, honey. You just stay here. It's fine. I'll send money when I can,
Don't have too many kids while I'm gone.
Right. You come back and there's 3 kids,
right.
too many.
Don't you remember, dear? This one was, he was in the other room when you left.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I'm so glad you explored the stories of these women, though, because like I said, it's what initially got me interested in researching those cemeteries in Central City to begin with, were the women's graves that I was super attracted to. And I just would go to these graves, and this was before I knew anything about them and not done any of the research, but just wondered what their lives were like and how they ended up in the cemetery up in the mountains, in this terrain that's rocky. And at the time it was ugly and, those things. And you just made me wonder, I'm like, how did these women deal with raising children, being married, and then in some cases taking over for many of them took over for their husbands because their husbands died long before they did, either due to illness or injuries, gunshots,
murder,
whatever might be the case. But so many of them outlived the husbands. So then it makes you wonder, well, what did they do? And a lot of them didn't always remarry. Like they might remarry once, but then after the second time, they're like, okay, done with that. It was enough. Moving on. So, and they lost so many children, and they still found the gumption to keep going and to keep surviving and living. And from looking at the photos that you found, they didn't wallow in self-pity or anything. They continued their lives, and they had a sense of humor, and they told stories, and they told weird poetry that nobody knew where it came from. Like, those are the things I love. They didn't let all these things that might today set somebody completely back. They were like, nope, we're just going to keep going. This is,
Right. And instead of just being gone and buried, their stories are still out there in so many cases to be found and told. And it gives, I think, a more broad voice to these communities too, not to deliberately choose that surname that we focused on so extensively, but we get to hear from different representation of society at the different times if we look a little harder for them, because they aren't always the first history you're going to come across.
Right.
Yeah,
these are the people
there.
Yeah. I mean, I had to look for the husbands, and that's like, then I'm sometimes really blessed that I find all kinds of great stuff because I looked for the husband instead of what. And I love this because you didn't focus on the husbands and what they did. It was on them. And we so forget that of, what the women accomplished, like Jennie was saying, what they lived through, suffered through, sacrificed for. And a lot of them probably didn't have the choice when husbands decided they wanted to move halfway across the country in this godforsaken territory of Colorado with still Indians and God knows what else out here. It's like they didn't have a choice. They can save no money and want to stay home.
Yeah. Well, I think we should continue, since we've already got Centennial filmed in Central City. How about, since there's a central mine here and Central City there, we just try to sell the epic of Central.
I love it. I love it. We just got to find the right producers in Hollywood. We'll get it. We'll get
Somebody
it.
with just the perfect curls in their hair to be Libby.
There's got to be a descendant out there, right? That like
Oh, surely.
would be super fascinated by this story and want to tell it. I love it. I love that you made so many
Feel like
connections.
her.
I love that you came here not
Mhm.
expecting to make those connections a year ago and went home after photographing Central City and Bald Mountain and all of that. And you were like, boom, 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 boom. Here they all are.
Yeah. And it's not none of this is by accident. I mean, it really isn't. It's now these stories will live on from
When I got home and I
what your
realized
research.
that I managed one of their sons' Find a Grave page already, I was like, okay, this just has to happen now. This is kind of
Mhm.
one of those meant to be sort of
Yep.
thing.
They were
Oh,
calling to you.
Yep. They do. They yell
They're
at
like, hi, look at me, I'm over here.
Mhm.
Don't forget me. Forget about him. Me.
Mm-hmm.
See, we've said it over and over in so many episodes with so many other guests and the who they choose to research and really focus on. There's always that moment of this really started to call to me and like you couldn't ignore it. Like you had to go figuring out who these people were. And the fact that you were able to branch out so much in this particular
Oh my
family
gosh.
tree
Yeah.
and make all these connections, even with so many of the same names, because that gets really confusing sometimes when you're going through the records and they all have the same name.
And Williams is not the most uncommon surname. I mean, there were a few
No.
challenges, but
I mean, I know I've run into it a couple of times just on stuff for our episodes where I'll be researching something and then I'll come across another article that has the same name, but then I start looking at it, I'm like, wait, these dates aren't adding up. So then I have to go back and do another round of research and think, oh, this is a nephew or this is a son or this is, and they just happen to have the exact same name. And so when you are inputting the name into the different places to search, that pops up because the name is the same, but it's
Right.
not the same person. So it can be very confusing on occasion. So
yeah.
I commend you for getting through so many Elizabeths and Elizas and all of those same names within the same family tree.
Well, and thank goodness for the families who, number one, have some of the family heirlooms and shared their information on like ancestry and stuff and find a grave so you can find them that
in
the
the public
letter
forums too, because you can make that stuff private on the
Right.
ancestry. You can totally make that a private thing and only your family can have access to it. So it's nice that those families wanted to continue to share the stories with everybody.
And just
Yeah.
that letter. I mean, how often do you find letters like that when he
Well, and then
wrote
there's
about his
another
kids?
letter that was written by Richard's mom after his death to one of his brothers. And you might want to consider putting up a link or something
Oh,
to
yeah.
that letter as well, because I didn't want to spend the whole time reading letters, but I feel like it is unusual to have these emotional pieces
Mhm.
that really, I mean, there's nothing that humanizes us more than showing shared emotion.
Yeah, especially at a death, you know, like you said, the deaths were so frequent and happened so often, but it still hurt when somebody died or when you lost your children or your spouse or whoever. Like it still was painful to these people, and but they still had to continue on with caring for the rest of their families. Like they couldn't just stop. But it's nice to hear
words.
the words.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to see it, like you said, in this case, it happened to be the husband that was writing to the mother about how heartbroken they were rather than the wife. Because we, as mothers, we probably know about the heartbreak, but like to see that the husband recognized it too and that he was feeling it just as much.
Yeah, that's what was
super bittersweet in that letter.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Oh, well, Lynette, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you came to Colorado.
Me too. And it's been a pleasure catching up a little bit too. And I'll let you know if I come up with any rabbit holes that seem to be leading in your direction again.
Oh, for sure. And I am
definitely.
going to be notifying the Gilpin County Historical Society of all your connections because I know that will excite them too. So they love that kind of stuff. So I will let them know and I'll make sure they know about the episode and everything coming out. But I think they'll be quite excited to hear some more of these stories. And I know some of them, like I said, they are familiar with, but others maybe will be brand new to them. So that'll be fun for them to have for their archives and their records out there.
It's like the rest of the story.
Yeah.
So it's really cool.
Yes, I love it. So
Colleen
thank you.
Harvey over here. Okay.
We thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat with Lynette Webber. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really helps makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at OrdExtraCem. So OrdExtraCem. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Diane and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.